You know, I've been hunting for over 30 years. Started when I was 12 with my old man's 22, shooting rabbits behind our farmhouse in southern Missouri. I thought I'd seen everything the woods could throw at me. Black bears, mountain lions, even stumbled across a meth lab once back in '98. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened at that cabin in October of 2019. I'm telling you this story because I need to. Because every night when I close my eyes, I'm right back there, smelling that damp wood rot and hearing, well, you'll understand soon enough. It started innocent enough. 4 of us had been hunting together since high school. Me, Tommy Brennan, Jake Morrison, and Big Mike Kowalski. We called ourselves the 4 Horsemen, though, after what happened, that name feels a hell of a lot darker now. We'd been talking for months about finding a new spot, somewhere we could hunt whitetail without dealing with crowds or posted land. The usual places were getting overrun with weekend warriors and guys with more money than sense. Tommy was always the tech guy among us. While the rest of us were still using paper maps, he was scrolling through hunting forums and lease websites on his phone. That's how we found it, buried deep in some obscure hunting lease database that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Clinton administration. "Boys," he said, calling us all on a 3-way that Tuesday evening in September. I found our golden ticket. The listing was simple, almost too simple. Secluded hunting cabin, 800 acres, prime whitetail habitat. $200 total for 4-day weekend lease. No cell service. Bring everything you need. Big Mike was skeptical from the start. $200 for 4 days? For all of us? That's $50 each, Tommy. What's the catch? Maybe there isn't one, Jake chimed in. He was always the optimist. Maybe it's just some old-timer who doesn't know what his land is worth. I should have listened to Mike's gut feeling, should have asked more questions, but the truth is, we were all hurting for money that year. The economy had been rough, and a cheap lease sounded like exactly what we needed. Tommy handled all the paperwork through email with someone who signed us property management services. No phone number, just email correspondence. The directions came as a PDF attachment, turn-by-turn instructions through a maze of county roads and logging trails that seemed to lead deeper and deeper into the Mark Twain National Forest. The night before we left, I was packing my gear in the garage when my wife Sarah came out with a cup of coffee. "You sure about this place?" she asked, leaning against my truck's tailgate. "You've got that look." "What look?" "The same look you had before that disastrous fishing trip to Bull Shoals, like you know something's not right but you're going anyway." I kissed her forehead and promised to be careful. Promised to call when we got there. Of course, I had no idea there wouldn't be any signal to call with. We met up at dawn Friday morning at the pilot truck stop off Highway 44. The October air was crisp, maybe 45 degrees, with that perfect hunting weather feel. Clear skies, light breeze, the kind of morning that makes your blood pump a little faster. I was driving my F1 150, loaded down with enough gear for a week even though we were only staying 4 days. Tommy rode with me, while Jake and Big Mike took Mike's Chevy Silverado. The drive started normal enough. We followed Interstate 44 west for about an hour, then turned south on a state highway that cut through rolling hills covered in oak and maple trees just starting to turn colours. The further we got from civilization, the better I felt. This was what hunting was supposed to be about, getting away from the noise, the stress, the constant buzz of modern life. But as we followed Tommy's printed directions deeper into the forest, something started feeling off. Not wrong exactly, but off. The roads got narrower, more overgrown. We passed fewer and fewer houses, then no houses at all. Just trees, and the occasional rusted mailbox standing guard over driveways that disappeared into the woods. "You sure we're going the right way?" I asked Tommy as we bumped along what was basically a glorified deer trail. He was squinting at the GPS on his phone, but the screen showed nothing but a blank green area. Signal's been dead for the last 10 miles, but according to these directions, we should be close. That's when we saw it. A break in the trees on our right, and a wooden sign so weathered and faded you could barely make out the words. Private property hunting lease. We turned down what I generously call a driveway. Really just 2 tyre ruts separated by a grass median that scraped against both our truck's undercarriages. The trees closed in overhead, creating a tunnel of branches that blocked out most of the morning sun. I had to turn on my headlights just to see where we were going. After maybe half a mile of bouncing through potholes that could swallow a small car, the woods opened up into a clearing, and there it was. our home for the next 4 days. The cabin looked exactly like what you'd expect from a $200 lease. 1 story, maybe 1,200 square feet, with a covered porch that sagged in the middle and a metal roof that had seen better decades. The whole structure had that grey, weathered look of wood that's been exposed to the elements for too long without proper maintenance, but it was solid. The foundation looked good, and smoke was actually coming from the chimney. "Well, I'll be damned," Big Mike said, climbing out of his truck. "Somebody's been here recently." That should have been our first clue that something wasn't right, but we were hunters, not detectives, and the sight of that smoke just meant we wouldn't have to start our own fire from scratch. We unloaded our gear and walked up to the front door. It was unlocked, which seemed both convenient and slightly unsettling. The inside was basic but functional. 2 small bedrooms with bunk beds, a combination kitchen and living area with a stone fireplace, and a bathroom that looked like it had been installed sometime during the Carter administration. The fire in the fireplace was burning low, just embers really, but it was definitely recent. Fresh ashes, still warm to the touch. "Maybe the owners were here this morning, getting it ready for us," Jake suggested, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. We spent the next hour getting settled, choosing bunks, organising our gear, planning our hunting strategy. The property seemed perfect for whitetail. Thick hardwood forest with natural clearings, a creek running through the back 40, plenty of sign. We found deer trails everywhere, fresh scrapes on trees, rubs that looked like they'd been made by some serious bucks. "This place is a gold mine," Tommy said, examining a rub on an oak tree that had to be 8 inches in diameter. Whatever we paid, it was worth it. We decided to scout that afternoon, get familiar with the layout before opening morning. I paired up with Jake while Tommy and Big Mike went the other direction. The plan was to meet back at the cabin before dark, compare notes, and decide on our stands for the morning. Jake and I headed east, following a game trail that wound through a creek bottom thick with cattails and wild rice. The woods were alive with sound, squirrels chattering, crows calling, the distant hammer of a woodpecker working on deadfall. It was perfect hunting country, the kind of place that makes you understand why our ancestors spent their lives chasing game through forests just like this one. We found the creek about a quarter mile from the cabin. It was maybe 15 feet wide, running clear and cold over a bed of smooth stones. Fresh deer tracks were pressed into the mud on both sides, does, fawns, and at least 2 different bucks based on the size and spacing of the hoof prints. "This is where I'm setting up tomorrow," Jake said, pointing to a natural blind formed by fallen logs about 30 yards from the water. "They'll come to drink right around sunrise." I nodded, but something was bothering me. It took me a minute to figure out what it was. "Jake," I said, "listen." He stopped talking, and we both stood perfectly still. That's when we heard it. Or rather, didn't hear it. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. The squirrels had stopped chattering. The crows had gone quiet. Even the creek seemed to be flowing more softly, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. "That's weird," Jake whispered. We stood there for maybe 2 minutes just listening. Then gradually, the normal sounds returned. A jay called from somewhere upstream. A squirrel barked at us from an oak tree. The forest came back to life. "Probably just a hawk flying over," I said, but I didn't believe it. Hawks don't make the entire woods go silent like that. We continued our scout, marking possible stand locations, noting the wind patterns, getting familiar with the terrain. By the time we headed back to the cabin, the afternoon sun was starting to filter through the trees at that perfect autumn angle that makes everything look like a postcard. Tommy and Big Mike were already back, sitting on the porch with beers from the cooler. "How'd you boys make out?" Mike called as we approached. "Good sign everywhere," Jake replied. "This place is going to be incredible." "Find anything interesting?" I asked, settling into one of the rickety porch chairs. Tommy and Mike exchanged a look. "Well," Tommy said slowly, "we found something, but we're not sure what to make of it." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellow with age and stained with what looked like water damage. "Found this nailed to a post under the porch," he said, handing it to me. "Had to crawl around back there to get it." I unfolded the paper carefully. The letterhead read, "Jackson County Health Department," and was dated March 15th, 1983. The text was partially faded, but I could make out the important parts. "Condemned, do not enter. This structure has been deemed unsafe for human habitation due to structural damage and potential health hazards. Entry is prohibited by County Ordinance 1983 to 47 inches. Below that, in smaller print, last occupants reported unusual activity in basement level, investigation pending. 1983, Big Mike said. That's almost 40 years ago. And somebody's been maintaining this place since then, Jake added. That fire didn't start itself. We all looked at each other, the same thought running through our minds. Should we stay, or should we go? Look, Tommy said finally. It's probably just some old paperwork that never got removed. Places get condemned and then get fixed up all the time. Somebody's obviously been using this cabin recently. But what about that part about unusual activity in basement level? I asked. I didn't see any basement when we looked around earlier. Neither did I, Mike said. But that doesn't mean there isn't one. We spent the next hour looking for access to a basement. Checked inside the cabin, walked around the perimeter, even crawled under the porch where Tommy had found the notice. Nothing. If there was a basement, the entrance was either hidden or sealed up. As the sun started setting, we decided to stay. We'd driven 5 hours to get there, paid for the lease, and taken time off work. A 40-year-old condemned notice didn't seem like enough reason to pack up and leave. Besides, the place felt solid. The roof didn't leak, the floorboards were sturdy, and that fireplace was throwing good heat. Whatever problems the cabin had in 1983, they seemed to have been resolved. We cooked dinner on the propane stove, steaks that Mike had brought, canned beans, and fresh bread from Jake's wife. It was the kind of meal that tastes better when you're eating it in the woods, away from civilization, with good friends, and the promise of hunting in the morning. As darkness fell, we sat around the fire drinking beer and telling the same hunting stories we'd been telling each other for 20 years. Mike's encounter with a black bear in Arkansas, Tommy's 8-point buck that got away when his scope fogged up, Jake's turkey hunt that turned into a comedy of errors when he got lost and ended up calling turkeys to him for 3 hours before realising he was using a crow call. It was perfect, exactly what we'd hoped for when we'd planned this trip. That's when we heard the first scratch. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable over the crackling of the fire and our conversation, a scraping sound, like claws on metal, coming from somewhere outside. "You hear that?" Tommy asked, holding up his hand for quiet. We all listened. The scratching continued for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. "Probably just a raccoon getting into the garbage," Jake said. But we hadn't put any garbage outside yet. Big Mike got up and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. "I don't see anything." The scratching started again, longer this time, more deliberate. It seemed to be coming from the direction of our trucks. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the door. "Let's go check it out." The 4 of us stepped out onto the porch, flashlights in hand, and immediately I knew something was wrong. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees since dinner, and there was a smell in the air, something musky and wild, like wet fur and old meat. We walked over to where we'd parked the trucks, our flashlight beams dancing across the clearing. At first, everything looked normal. Then Tommy's light hit the side of my F-150. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. 4 parallel scratches ran along the driver's side door, each about 18 inches long and deep enough to cut through the paint down to the metal. They started at the door handle and curved upward towards the window, as if something had tried to climb up the side of the truck. "What the hell could do that?" Jake asked, running his fingers along the gouges. Big Mike was examining his Silverado. "Same thing over here, 4 scratches, same pattern." The scratches on Mike's truck were even deeper, and there were additional marks on the tailgate and bumper. Whatever had done this was strong enough to leave gouges in steel. "Bear," Tommy suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "I've seen bear damage before. Bears will tear up a camp looking for food, but they don't typically scratch vehicles in such a methodical pattern, and the scratches were too uniform, too deliberate." We spent the next 20 minutes walking the perimeter of the clearing, looking for tracks, scat, anything that might tell us what we were dealing with. The ground was too hard and covered with leaves to show clear prints, but we found broken branches and disturbed undergrowth that suggested something large had been moving through the area. "Maybe we should sleep in shifts," Mike suggested as we headed back to the cabin. "Keep someone awake to watch." We agreed to 2-hour shifts. I volunteered for the first watch from midnight to 2 a.m. The others would take turns after that, keeping the fire going and watching the windows until dawn. Before we settled in for the night, I decided to check something that had been bothering me. I walked around to the back of the cabin, looking for any sign of a basement entrance. The condemned notice had specifically mentioned basement level, and I wanted to know where it was. That's when I found it. Hidden behind an overgrown lilac bush was a set of concrete steps leading down to what looked like a cellar door. The door itself was made of heavy wooden planks, secured with a massive padlock that looked newer than the rest of the hardware. But what caught my attention wasn't the lock, it was the scratch marks. The door was covered with them, hundreds of parallel gouges, some old and weathered, others that looked fresh. They weren't random scratches either. They formed patterns, almost like symbols carved deep into the wood. I called the others over, and we stood there staring at that door, none of us saying what we were all thinking. "We need to get out of here," Big Mike said finally, "right now. Pack up and drive back to town." But as we turned to head back to the cabin, we heard an engine starting. My truck? We ran around to the front of the cabin just in time to see my F-150's headlights flick on. The engine was running, idling roughly, but there was nobody in the driver's seat. "How is that possible?" Tommy asked. "The keys are in my pocket." I reached for my keys and felt them right where they should be, but my truck was definitely running. The engine revved once, twice, then shut off. The headlights went out, leaving us standing in the darkness with only our flashlights. "Electrical problem," Jake said, but his voice was shaking. "Some kind of short circuit." We approached the truck carefully, as if it might start up again at any moment. I tried the door handle, locked. Looked through the windows, empty. The keys in my pocket still worked, but when I unlocked the truck and checked the ignition, there was nothing there. No hot wiring, no foreign keys, nothing that could explain how the engine had started. "This is fucked," Mike said bluntly. "This whole place is fucked, and we need to leave." But when we tried to start our trucks to drive out, neither one would turn over. Both engines were completely dead. The battery showed full power, the fuel gauges read full, but the engines wouldn't even attempt to start. We were stuck. "It's probably just the cold," Tommy said, though the temperature hadn't dropped below freezing. "Engines sometimes won't start in cold weather. We'll try again in the morning." What else could we do? Walk 30 miles through the woods in the dark? We were hunters, not hikers, and none of us knew the area well enough to navigate back to the main road without daylight. So we went back inside, secured the door, and tried to convince ourselves that everything had a logical explanation. I took the first watch, sitting in a chair by the front window, with my .3006 across my lap. The fire was burning low, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the forest was perfectly quiet. No owl calls, no night sounds, nothing but the occasional pop and crackle from the fireplace. Around 1 a.m, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone walking very carefully to avoid making noise. They started at the left end of the porch and moved steadily toward the front door. I woke the others with a touch, putting my finger to my lips for quiet. We all grabbed our rifles and positioned ourselves around the room, watching the windows and door. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the door. We waited, hardly breathing for maybe 5 minutes. Then we heard the doorknob turn. The door was locked and it held, but something was definitely trying to get in. The knob turned left, then right, then left again. Then came a soft tapping, almost polite, like someone knocking who didn't want to wake the neighbours. "Who's there?" Big Mike called out, though his voice cracked as he said it. The tapping stopped. The doorknob went still. Then we heard my name. David. It was barely a whisper, so soft I almost missed it. But it was definitely my name, spoken by a voice I didn't recognise. The others looked at me with questions in their eyes. I shook my head. I had no idea who it could be or how they knew my name. "David." The voice came again, a little louder this time. It seemed to be coming from right outside the door, as if someone was standing on the porch with their mouth pressed against the wood. "What do you want?" I called back. No answer. Just that terrible silence. After about 10 minutes, we heard the footsteps again, moving away from the door and off the porch. But instead of disappearing into the woods, they seemed to circle the cabin. We could track the sound as it moved along the side of the building, around to the back, then up the other side. The footsteps stopped outside the window where Tommy was standing watch. "It's looking in," Tommy whispered, his face pale in the firelight. I moved to the window and peered out through a gap in the curtains. In the darkness, I could make out a shape, tall, thin, standing perfectly still about 6 feet from the glass. I couldn't see details, but something about the proportions was wrong. The arms were too long, hanging down past where the knees should be, and the head was too big, or shaped wrong, or something. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, pointing the beam directly at the figure. Nothing. Empty woods. But the window glass was fogged, as if something had been breathing on it from the outside. The rest of the night passed in tense quiet. We took turns at the windows, watching for movement, listening for sounds. Twice more we heard my name whispered from somewhere outside the cabin. Once, Jake swore he saw a face looking through the back window. But when the rest of us looked, there was nothing there. By dawn, we were all exhausted and on edge. The morning light filtering through the trees should have made everything seem normal again, but somehow it didn't. The woods still felt wrong, like we were being watched. We tried the trucks again, still dead. "We need to hike out," Big Mike said. "Get back to the main road and find help. It's at least 30 miles, Jake pointed out. "Through woods we don't know. Better than staying here another night." I was inclined to agree, but first I wanted to check one more thing. The basement door we'd found behind the cabin. In daylight, maybe we could figure out what was down there. The padlock was gone. The door stood slightly ajar, just enough to show a rectangle of absolute darkness beyond. The scratches we'd seen the night before looked even more extensive in daylight. Hundreds of parallel gouges covering every inch of the wooden surface. "I'm going down there," I said. "The hell you are," Mike replied. "That's exactly what people do in horror movies right before they die. But I had to know. Call it curiosity, call it stupidity, but after everything that had happened, I needed to understand what we were dealing with." I pushed the door open and shined my flashlight down a set of stone steps that disappeared into blackness. The air that came up from below was cold and damp, with that same musky smell we'd noticed the night before. 5 minutes, I told the others. "If I'm not back in 5 minutes, leave without me." The basement was bigger than the cabin above it, with rough stone walls and a dirt floor. It was empty, except for a few pieces of rotted furniture and something that looked like old camping gear scattered in one corner. But it was the walls that made my blood run cold. They were covered with writing, not carved like the scratches on the door, but written in what looked like charcoal burned wood. Words, dates, names, all scrawled in desperate, shaky handwriting. "Something in the woods. It knows our names. Can't leave. Trucks won't start. Day 6. Tom hasn't come back." And then, near the bottom of one wall, in fresher writing that looked like it had been added recently, October 2019. 4 hunters. David, Tommy, Jake, Mike. It's starting again. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. Someone had been down here recently, someone who knew our names, knew we were coming. I ran back up the stairs, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "We're leaving," I gasped as I reached the others. "Right now, on foot. I don't care how far it is." I told them what I'd found, and within 10 minutes we had our packs loaded with water, food and ammunition. We left everything else behind. Sleeping bags, camp stoves, even our extra clothes. All that mattered was getting out of those woods alive. We started hiking due south, following the compass on Tommy's watch. The plan was to hit the state highway we'd driven in on, then follow it back to civilization. But after 2 hours of walking, we found ourselves back at the cabin. "That's impossible," Jake said, staring at the familiar building. "We've been walking in a straight line." We tried again, this time heading due east. Same result. 3 hours of hiking through thick woods, and we ended up right back where we started. "The compass must be broken," Tommy said, but when we checked it against mine, both were pointing in the same direction. That's when we heard the voice again. "David." It was coming from the woods behind us, maybe 50 yards away, closer than it had been the night before. We turned and ran, not back to the cabin, but into the forest, crashing through underbrush, jumping over fallen logs, desperate to put distance between ourselves and whatever was calling my name. We ran until we couldn't run anymore, then kept running. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, we were standing in another clearing, with another cabin. It looked identical to the one we'd left behind, down to the sagging porch and the metal roof, but this one was in worse shape. Windows broken, door hanging off its hinges, roof partially collapsed. "What the hell?" Mike whispered. I walked up to the porch and found another notice, this one newer than the first, dated 1987. Condemned do not enter. Second structure on property deemed unsafe after incident involving 4 hunters. Basement sealed. Property to remain vacant. Below that, in smaller print, victims' vehicles found with extensive damage, bodies never recovered. Tommy found a third notice, dated 1994. Then Jake found a fourth, from 2003. Each one told the same story. Hunters who came to the property, strange incidents, abandoned vehicles, missing persons. "How many cabins are there?" Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We spent the next hour exploring the woods around the clearing. We found 6 more cabins, each one in progressively worse condition, each one with its own condemned notice. The dates went back to 1963, when the first group of hunters had reported unusual activity and vanished. Every 16 years, like clockwork. And 2019 was 16 years after 2003. It's some kind of cycle, Tommy said as we sat on the porch of the newest abandoned cabin. Something that happens every 16 years, and we walked right into it. But what is it? Jake asked. What could be killing hunters for over 50 years? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we were part of the pattern now, and if we didn't find a way out of these woods, we'd end up like all the others. That's when we heard the engines, our trucks starting up back at the first cabin. We ran toward the sound, crashing through the forest with renewed hope. Maybe we could finally get out of this nightmare. But when we reached the clearing, both trucks were gone. The only sign they'd ever been there were the tyre tracks leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the woods. Someone stole our trucks, Big Mike said, but even as he said it, we all knew it wasn't true. The tracks were too deep, too uniform, and they led not toward the road we'd come in on, but deeper into the forest, toward a part of the woods we hadn't explored yet. We followed the tracks for about a mile, until they led us to a natural sinkhole, maybe 30 feet across and impossibly deep. The tracks went right to the edge and stopped. At the bottom of the sinkhole, barely visible in the shadows, were the rusted remains of dozens of vehicles. Cars, trucks, motorcycles, even what looked like an old school bus. All of them stacked like toys in the bottom of a pit that seemed to go down forever. Jesus, Tommy whispered. How long has this been going on? I was looking at the newest additions to the collection. 2 pickup trucks, one blue, one red, that looked exactly like ours. That's when I heard my name again. David. This time, the voice was coming from behind us. We turned, and there it was. I can't describe what we saw, because my mind still won't let me process it completely. It was tall, maybe 8 feet, with limbs that bent in ways that human limbs shouldn't bend. Its skin was pale and smooth, like something that had never seen sunlight, and its eyes were the worst part. They weren't animal eyes or human eyes. They were something else entirely, something that belonged in nightmares, not in the real world. David, it said again, and this time I realized the voice was coming from my own mouth. It was mimicking me, using my voice to call my name. We ran. 4 grown men, armed with high-powered rifles, ran like children from something that shouldn't have existed. But it followed us. Not running, just walking with that strange loose-jointed gait that covered ground faster than it should have been able to. No matter how fast we moved, it stayed the same distance behind us, never gaining, never falling back. "Shoot it!" Mike yelled. But when we turned and fired, our bullets seemed to pass right through it without effect. We ran for what felt like hours, deeper and deeper into woods that grew thicker and darker with every step. The trees seemed to close in around us, branches grabbing at our clothes, roots trying to trip us. Finally, exhausted and gasping, we stumbled back into the original clearing. The cabin was exactly as we'd left it, but now there was smoke coming from the chimney again. "Someone's inside," Jake whispered. We approached carefully, rifles ready. The front door was standing open, and we could see the warm glow of firelight from within. Inside, the cabin looked different, clean, well maintained, like it had looked when we'd first arrived, before everything went wrong. And sitting in chairs around the fireplace were 4 men. They looked up as we entered, and I felt my blood turn to ice. It was us. Not similar to us, not men who looked like us. It was actually us, sitting around that fire, drinking beer and laughing. "Hey there," the other version of me said with a friendly wave. "You boys look like you've had a rough day. Why don't you sit down and rest a spell?" "This isn't real," Tommy whispered. "This can't be real." But the other Tommy laughed and held up his beer. Real as anything else in these woods, partner. That's when I understood. We weren't the first group of hunters to find this place. We were just the latest in a line stretching back decades, and now we were part of it. Part of whatever cycle played out in these woods every 16 years. The thing in the forest, the creature that had been following us, wasn't hunting us. It was herding us, bringing us back to the cabin, back to the place where we'd started so the cycle could continue. Sit down, the other version of Big Mike said, patting the chair next to him. We've got a lot to talk about. And that's when I realised the truth that made my sanity fracture like glass. We were never leaving these woods. We were going to become part of them, part of the thing that lured other hunters to this place every 16 years. We'd become the bait, the friendly voices that would call out names in the darkness, the figures that would scratch truck doors and tap on windows. The condemned notices weren't warnings about structural damage. They were tombstones. David, my other self said, using that same voice I'd been hearing all along. Welcome home. I don't remember much after that. There was a period of darkness, of confusion, of feeling like I was watching my life from outside my body. When I came back to myself, I was sitting in a ranger station, wrapped in a blanket, talking to a park service officer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Son, he said quietly, you've been missing for 6 days. We found you walking along the Highway 44, about 30 miles from where your truck was parked. You were delirious, talking about cabins and creatures and voices in the woods. My friends, I said. Tommy, Jake, Mike, where are they? The ranger's expression grew even more somber. We're still looking for them. We found their campsite, but there's no sign of your friends. Their trucks are still there, but... But what? The trucks are damaged. I look like something with claws tore them up pretty good. Fish and Game thinks it might have been a bear, but I've never seen bear damage like that. I tried to tell him about the cabin, about the condemned notices, about the thing in the woods, but the more I talked, the more he looked at me like I was having a mental breakdown. Maybe I was. They kept me in the hospital for 3 days, running tests, making sure I didn't have a head injury or hypothermia. The doctors said I was suffering from acute stress reaction, that being lost in the woods for almost a week had played tricks with my mind. But I know what I saw. I know what happened in those woods. My friends are still listed as missing persons. The official report says they probably got lost, that their bodies will turn up eventually when the weather warms up and the snow melts. But I know better. They're still out there, in those woods, waiting for the next group of hunters to find that lease agreement online, waiting to call out names in the darkness, to scratch truck doors, to lead new victims to the sinkhole where all the vehicles end up. Every 16 years, like clockwork. I've never hunted again. Can't stand the thought of being alone in the woods, of hearing my name whispered from the darkness. Sarah says I've changed, that I wake up screaming about cabins and condemned notices and things that walk on 2 long limbs. She's right. I have changed, because part of me is still back there, in that clearing, sitting around a fire with versions of myself that shouldn't exist. Part of me is still trapped in that cycle, waiting for 2035, when the next group of hunters will find a lease agreement that's too good to be true. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees outside my house, I hear it. My own voice calling my name from the darkness. David. It's getting closer every year. And I know that someday I'm going to answer. Someday, I'm going to walk out into those woods and join my friends around that eternal fire, waiting to welcome the next group of hunters who think they've found the perfect lease. The cycle never breaks. It just keeps turning, like a wheel made of bone and shadow and voices in the darkness. 16 years. The clock is ticking, and somewhere in the Mark Twain National Forest, in a clearing that doesn't appear on any map, a cabin is waiting. Clean, well maintained, with smoke coming from the chimney, just like it was when we first arrived, just like it will be when you arrive. Because you will arrive, eventually. All hunters do. The woods are calling your name right now. Can you hear them?